Hey everyone, all three of you watching this. I'm going to make a bit of a departure from the theme of my last few videos and do something slightly different. All of my last few videos were Amiga related, and this time we're going to make a video about this little bundle of joy. This isn't exactly a surprise unboxing because I already know what's in here. I bought it on eBay, but let's open it together and then we can talk about its contents. Alright, safe to say I wasn't going to win any speed opening contests, so there's a jump cut here. This is a fond memory of childhood for me, the ZX Spectrum Plus 3. You can argue whether or not this is really a Spectrum because it was made after the acquisition of Sinclair Research by Amstrad in 1986, but it was my second Spectrum after our ZX Spectrum 48K, and by far my favourite Spectrum. So let's just talk about that history for a second. The ZX Spectrum was released in 1982, and it was a successor to Sinclair Research's ZX81, powered by the same Z80 CPU at 3.5 MHz as its predecessor, doubling the size of the ROM from 8K to 16K, increasing the RAM from 1K to 16K or 48K, adding colour capability and a bitmap resolution comparable to its best contemporaries like the Atari 800, and single-channel sound, made the ZX Spectrum one of, if not the best-selling home microcomputer in the UK by 1983. The colour capabilities came with something of a compromise though. The colour information was stored separately from the pixel bitmap, so while the bitmap was 256 by 192 pixels, the colour was stored as a grid of 32 by 24 cells, each of those cells being 8 pixels by 8 pixels in size. Each cell could have a single foreground and background colour, a brightness flag and a flashing flag. And while this was an extremely efficient way to store the colour information, ultimately patented by Richard Outwasser as designer, it gave us the eponymous colour clash, and a reason for our Commodore and Atari owning friends to poke fun at us. It's hard to describe colour clash in words, so here's an example. As you can see, because of the way the colour information is stored, the colours don't actually follow the boundary of an irregular shape. They follow 8 by 8 squares, giving a sort of halo effect at best and some truly awful imagery at worst. Anyway, there are plenty of other videos out there about colour clash or attribute clash, and I'll leave it to them to go into more depth. Despite its limitations, the ZX Spectrum was the best computer my parents could afford at the time. And although I had no concept of the cost then, I was only around 7, the £129 cost was the equivalent of about £400 today, so I consider myself very lucky indeed to have had any computer at all. After the ZX Spectrum came the expanded Sinclair Research models. The Plus in 1984 added a proper keyboard to replace the rubber keys of the original model. It was otherwise identical. The 128 in 1985, which looked very similar to the Plus but with the addition of a finned heatsink on the side, gave it the nickname the Toast Rack. It was the first real upgrade. It added 128K of RAM, new basic commands to interact with the RAM disk, 3-channel audio, MIDI possibilities, a serial port, RGB port, and 32K of ROM. One technical challenge here is that the Z80 processor can only address 64K of memory, so bank switching was used to address the remaining memory as 8 pages of 16K. That carried through all the way to the Plus 3. In 1986, Sinclair Research and the Spectrum brand were purchased by Amstrad, and suddenly our Spectrums and the equivalent Amstrad models became hard to distinguish with the release of the Spectrum Plus 2, which looked a lot like the Amstrad CPC 464. Don't let 8-year-old me hear you say that. Essentially it was 128 with a cassette recorder glued to the side. At least it was still narrower than the giant CPC 464, which had an additional keyboard area for arrow keys and made it an enormous 0.5 meter wide. In 1987, the Plus 3 was released, and we're right up to date with what sits in front of us. Instead of a cassette strapped to the side, there's a 3-inch disc drive. Yes, 3-inch, not 3.5. The discs were, even then, as I recall, incredibly expensive compared to the much more common 3.5-inch discs. To me, back then, they felt so much more rugged than the 3.5, and definitely more rugged than the 5.25-inch floppies that we used at school in the BBC Micros. The Plus 3 came with a new disk operating system called Plus 3 DOS. It was a modified version of Amstrad's PCW DOS. It was stored in an entirely new 16K ROM, and there were a number of other significant changes that caused owners and me problems with some software written for earlier machines simply not running on the Plus 3. But we did gain the ability to run CP/M without needing extra hardware. Not that 8-year-old me knew what CP/M was. After the Plus 3, the only new Spectrums were redesigns of the Plus 2 and the Plus 3 to reduce cost. I don't know if this machine in front of us is a Plus 3 or a Plus 3B yet. It's hard for me to tell from the outside, so we'll have to open it up and have a look around in a future video. The differences are quite obvious once you're in there. The Plus 3B lacks any tape drive circuitry, and the Plus 2B has no provision for the disk controller. Anyway, I've rambled on quite a bit about the history of these machines. The fact is, if it wasn't for the 48K and the Plus 3 that followed it, I probably wouldn't have had the career I've had as an adult. They were the machines that taught me how to program, how to tinker, and how computers work. I spent many evenings typing in basic listings from magazines and some machine code listings and working through examples in the manuals, plus of course many evenings playing games like Ghostbusters or Attic Attack. There were a lot of machines that followed this for me. The Plus 3 eventually stopped reading floppy disks and needed replacement, and if memory serves, I replaced it with an Acorn Electron, which was sort of the poor cousin of the BBC Model Bs and Masters that we used at school. Eventually that too was replaced by an Amiga 500, and before that, well, that gave way to dozens of PCs, and much more recently Macs. The only machines I'm really still fond of are those from the 8 and 16-bit era. The Spectrums, the Amiga. It was really the simplicity and the ease and the wonder of the Spectrum that captured my childhood imagination, and that led me to a 20+ year career on IT. And that, I think, for now, will do. I'm going to go ahead and see exactly what we're working with here, what needs to be done to restore it. I already know it needs a new drive for the disk drive, and we'll come back with another Spectrum related video later. But for now, I'll sign off, and I just want to add, this was the first video that I've written a script for. Let me know if you think it helped or if it was just a hindrance. That's all for now. I'll see you guys soon.